Welcome to St. Michael's Hospital. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Tim Rutledge, and I am privileged to be the President and CEO at St. Mike's and the broader Unity Health Toronto. We're very thrilled that you're all here today to join us for our 6th annual Louis L. Odette Lecture. This lecture brings together leaders on homelessness and mental health. Together, we shine a spotlight on some of the toughest challenges facing people experiencing disadvantage. Then we work to find solutions to these challenges. Before we begin, I would like to sincerely thank the Odette family for supporting vital initiatives that incubate innovative programs to tackle Toronto's homeless crisis. You are true Canadian philanthropic leaders and community leaders, and we sincerely thank you for your contributions. We are also so honored that the P&L Odette Charitable Foundation has chosen to partner with St. Michael's Hospital. With your support, we can make Toronto a place where people from all walks of life can thrive. St. Michael's Hospital is many things. We're a level 1 trauma center. We're a global powerhouse in medical research and patient care, a leading teaching center affiliated with University of Toronto, and an inner-city hospital with strong ties to our local communities. Every day, our world-leading medical teams dig deep to find solutions to intractable medical problems. They advocate on behalf of those whose health is complicated by life circumstances, and a big part of our mission is providing care for populations experiencing disadvantage and social marginalization. Tonight's topic, deconstructing homelessness, is a focus of what many of us do here at St. Mike's. Affectionately known as Toronto's urban angel, St. Mike's sees the full spectrum of Toronto's downtown community. All are welcome here at St. Mike's. And our commitment to serving Toronto's urban community goes well beyond a welcoming attitude. It goes to a relentless commitment to tailoring our care, coming up with evidence-based solutions, and informing public policy so that no group falls through the cracks. This is at the heart of who we are as an organization, central to our mission, history, values, and vision. It happens that today, October 10th, is World Homeless Day. It is also World Mental Health Day. The link between these two is sadly well established, making today's lecture most timely. We hope you walk away from this evening with new ideas on ways to address the inequities facing communities experiencing disadvantage. Thanks again to the Odette family for their unwavering support, and thanks to all of you for joining us. And it is now my pleasure to call upon our moderator for this evening, Dr. Tom Ungar, Psychiatrist and Chief at St. Michael's Hospital, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everybody to this evening. I'm looking forward to a stimulating conversation as we've had every other year with this wonderful lecture. I'm pleased to be here, inspired what we're hoping to achieve tonight. On any given night in Toronto, 10,000 people are homeless. Many, not all, but very many, suffer from mental health, mental illness, and addiction issues. So tonight our objective is to cast light on the challenges people who are homeless and often suffering from mental illness and addictions issues, keeping and maintaining housing. We're going to share some of the amazing work we do here at St. Michael's and our affiliated community agencies, and what we all do together to try to solve the homelessness crisis. Wouldn't it be great if one day there was zero homelessness? Hear, hear. Thank you, as Tim mentioned, to the Odette family's generosity, which funds tonight's lecture, given by a trailblazing figure in the area of homelessness to highlight challenges to and the progress on improving the lives of people experiencing chronic homelessness. Because of their generosity, we're able to present an internationally renowned leader in urban planning, Jennifer Keesmaat. We'll hear from Jennifer, and then we have 4 panelists here where the rubber hits the road, practitioners of homelessness and the challenges we face. Jennifer Keesmaat is one of our most passionate champions for keeping Toronto a livable and affordable city. A change agent, she's known for bold ideas. for collaboration, for dialogue, and for advancing agendas that will allow every resident to flourish. As many of you know, Jennifer served as Chief City Planner from Toronto from 2012 to 2017. After an appointment at the John Busfield Distinguished Visitorship in Planning at the University of Toronto, she ran for Mayor of the City of Toronto on a very progressive platform that included addressing the housing crisis by building at scale on city-owned land and implementing a rent-to-own program. She then took a position as CEO of Creative Housing Society, an independent nonprofit group dedicated to creating affordable housing projects. And now she's CEO of the Keesmaat Group, a company that works with corporate and political leaders to advance change in cities around the world. She's been named one of the most powerful people in Canada by Maclean's, one of the most influential by Toronto Life, and one of the top women of influence in Canada. Her presentation today focuses on the need to build cities that respond to the diversity of housing needs that exist, including stages of life and participation in the economy. Jennifer, please come up. We welcome you and look forward to this.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, humbled to be here. Thank you to the Odette family for both their work in the community, but also for this important evening. This is the 6th annual lecture on homelessness, and I'm not sure there's anything quite like it anywhere else in the country. And it's a critical and important conversation for us to continue to have, because we, in fact, have everything we need. We have the money, we have the resources, we have everything that we need to ensure that we meet that objective of ensuring that no one in our city is homeless. I have the great pleasure of working with cities all over the world, in Australia, on the East Coast, in Los Angeles. And one of the things that's quite startling is that homelessness is something that is, of course, growing on a global scale. I'd like to tell you a little bit tonight about some of the places that have figured it out, that have figured out housing. And it might surprise you to hear how it is that they've figured this out, what the critical success factors are. And precisely because of that, I'd like to begin by talking about the housing continuum. Because surprisingly, we often focus on, at sessions like this, we focus on homelessness and emergency shelters, transitional homelessness, when in reality, if we're going to fix homelessness, we need to fix housing overall. And to fix housing overall, we need to actually begin on the other end of the spectrum. We need to begin by clearly understanding what is happening when it comes to market housing in our cities and on our globe. So I'd like to walk through a little bit of this story, beginning with talking about market home ownership, mostly, as well as market rental. You can bundle the two together. And there's two myths that I'd like to tackle, that I'd like to dispose of, so that we can begin to get to the other end of the spectrum, talking about what's happening around homelessness and emergency shelters, and why we have a need for emergency shelters in our cities. So I'll first talk a little bit about what I'm calling the free market myth, and then the equity myth, because these seem to be a critical part of our undoing in seeking to provide housing for everyone in our cities and in our countries. You know, it's kind of funny, but when you talk about housing, you talk about homelessness, there's no one who says, well, you know, homelessness is never going to go away. There aren't a lot of people who say, oh, well, this is just part of modern life. It's just the way it is. There are very few people who don't want to see a fix. There are very few people who don't feel shame about having a city that is so wealthy and at the same time cannot manage to house everyone that lives within it. Very few people don't feel that shame. Most people actually do. I think one of the reasons why we've struggled to really tackle and address homelessness is because we haven't actually figured out our larger housing system. And that once we figure out how all of these pieces on the housing continuum link together, and how there's some fundamental flaws throughout that entire continuum, then we can begin to unlock, to really resolve this problem of having a city where not everyone has access to good housing. So let's start with the free market myth. Let's start here. So this myth, which is one that I'm going to untangle this over several decades, but this myth is that the idea that market housing will adequately house most people throughout their lifetimes. I think most of us have actually believed this at one point in time. I know I believed it for a long time. I thought the market can house most people. Sure it can. Why wouldn't it be able to? Well, I'd just like to unpack that a little bit, because I actually believe that was once true. That was true at one point in time. So 1970 may seem like an arbitrary year. It actually is, but it was the year I was born. So I thought that's where I would start. It's within my lifetime. My mom and dad were married in the late 60s. They were very young. They were high school sweethearts. My mom was 20, and my dad was 21 when they married. They immediately had children. They immediately had 2 daughters, my older sisters. And as my mom said, because you didn't think about it back then, that's what you were supposed to do. You got married, you had children, you got a house. So I came along in 1970. At that point, they were still in their early 20s. And I've got a little bit of a snapshot just to remind you of what was happening in the world back in 1970. What's interesting is that there was no question. My mom dropped out of the workforce to stay at home with us as kids. So they were a one-income family. And there was no question that they would buy a house. Of course they would. So here they were in their early 20s, and they owned a house. This was not meant to be an equity investment tool. This was a home to raise their family. And at that time, housing was 2 times the average wage. So the average wage in 1970 was $23,000 a year. So the average home was actually $46,000 a year. So if you think about that for a minute, double your annual wage. So the idea of being able to buy that home, you have a little bit of debt, you're going to be diligent and pay off that debt, but you could reasonably pay off that debt within a decade, maybe 15 years, and then your family would be housed. They would have access to a stable home, and that was very much the way my mom and dad thought. At that point in time, I think it's safe to say that the market and market housing was actually conjoined with wages in such a way that it was entirely reasonable to believe that the market could provide housing for most people. And just to set the stage, my father was a builder. He wasn't in a profession. He wasn't making a tremendous amount of money, but he was making an average salary, and he could afford to buy a house and have housing that was very stable for his young family. So that was 1970. So let's fast forward to 2000. So 2000, I'm telling you a bit of my life story here, because 2000 was the year that I bought my first home. So here I am, I'm 30 years old. So I'm about 10 years older than my mom and dad. And in 2000, my husband and I buy our first home. My husband is the executive director of a not-for-profit organization working with at-risk youth. So he's making a nice salary, but not a massive one, but he's a stable job. And I'm an entry-level planner. I've just begun in the planning profession, and I'm an entry-level planner. And with our 2 incomes combined, we couldn't do it with one, like my mom and dad did. So we fast forward to 30 years later, you need 2 incomes. And we're also 10 years older. We'd actually lived for a few years in my in-laws' basement so that we could save for a down payment. But it was still a little bit of a stretch for us, so we had a tenant in our house. For our first 5 years, we had a tenant to help us pay the rent. So here we are in 2000. Things have shifted from my mom and dad's time. Now, here we are, and what we discover is that housing is actually 5 times the average income in Canada. So that's what's happened over 30 years. But, you know, we can still sort of make that work. My husband and I made that work. It's safe to say the market was able, and at that time was still able to provide housing for most people, could access housing within the housing market. So then something happened. And this is a really important part of the housing market. And it's a really important reason as to why we see challenges with accessing housing across the entire world. And it's this. In 2008, we saw a massive crash, which we like to talk about as the financial crisis. That's what we typically call it. We say in 2008, there was a financial crisis in the States, that the banks had been lending too much money. I actually like to call it a housing crisis, because that's what it really was. What happened was people were way, way too deeply in debt. They could not afford to pay for their housing. They had subprime loans, so this had been enabled by a deregulated banking sector, and it all caught up with everyone at the same time, and the house of cards fell apart. And whereas it had appeared that the market was providing housing that people could access, in fact, that turned out to be a shell game. That wasn't actually true. Now, we were protected from this in the Canadian context in some ways, but there's a very big implication which followed us. And that big implication is this. When more than a third of people in America actually lost access to the homes that they owned, there were hundreds of thousands of foreclosures that were happening on an annual basis. And not far from here, just really a few hours, you can drive to Detroit. And Detroit still today has an Office of Housing Demolition. You know what they do in the Office of Housing Demolition? They take down abandoned homes. Homes that had been built that now have no value, and no one is living in them. That is still an implication of what happened in the housing market in 2008. This is a really important part of understanding the overall dynamic of the housing market. But as a result, there was a bargain to be had in America. There was a great bargain to be had. Foreclosed homes, so financial institutions, real estate investment vehicles, large corporations actually became embedded in the housing market, really for the first time at a significant scale. So now we see this new dynamic where we have large institutions that are actually buying homes and renting them back to people. So we tend to think of traditionally in cities that when you see a higher density product, multi-residential family housing, it's more likely to be a rented product, and single family homes are more likely to be owned by individuals. Well, today, in America, 35% of single family homes are actually owned by large corporations. They're rented. This is quite surprising. This is a very different dynamic than 1970, when people were buying homes, paying them off within a few years, and they had a wonderful, stable place to live. Now, we've actually seen a complete shift in the way we think about housing. So now let's look at 2019. Let's look at today. If we look at what's happening on a global scale, it's hard to miss. Donald Trump being president, of course. We now know that climate change is a big part in thinking about our long-term sustainability, is shifting the way we think about everything, including access to housing. In 2019, now remember, those financial players burst into the housing scene in 2008, but they didn't just burst into the housing scene in America. They burst into the housing scene across the world. There was a repercussion across the world, and it happened here too. Now what we find is housing is 12 times the average income. 12 times. So let me back this up for a minute. As planners, one of the things that we do in our work, when we're approving new housing to be built, so in the public sector, we act as an enabler. We don't build the housing, but we have all the levers that enables the industry to build the housing. One of the things that we want to do is make sure that you don't want too much housing to be built, because then you'll have what's called a bubble, and the whole thing will crash. But you also don't want not enough housing to be built, because if there isn't enough housing, then theoretically, prices will go really, really high, and people won't be able to afford housing. Sort of supply and demand. So as planners, we look at things like population growth. So we look at population growth and we ensure that we're approving enough new housing to meet the anticipated population growth. And the theory is that if you have those two things in balance, you should have enough housing product for everyone in your city at a reasonable price. None of that is true. That's not the way it works at all. It doesn't work that way at all anymore for a very simple reason. It did in 1970. It doesn't work that way at all anymore, because now we have investors, we have other players who are buying houses not as homes, but as an equity vehicle, as a product, as a way to store cash. That's something very different than a house that is a home. Those are two very different things. So as planners, it really has really messed up looking at supply and demand. It doesn't work anymore. What happens when suddenly houses are 12 times annual wages? Well, it means people who live in the city, earning a wage in that city, cannot actually afford a home, cannot afford market housing. This is what's happened in the Toronto context. Part of the challenge is a bit like thinking, the example I like to use, because I understand it, is shoes. If we assume that every pair of feet on the planet gets one pair of shoes, we can control supply and demand. But if we assume that each pair of feet has multitude pairs of shoes, then you can't really say supply and demand will determine price, because one person might have 5 pairs of shoes and another person might have 50 pairs of shoes. Well, that's what actually happened with housing. It used to be that one family, one home. But now you can have one investor who owns hundreds of homes. We've disconnected a household from a home. And we see this most strongly in the fact that houses are now 12 times the average wage. So we've ended up in this situation where, as a result of a whole variety of challenges that come from the financial industry, we have some very serious problems in our housing supply. And if we think back to the housing continuum, there are repercussions all the way along that continuum. Because when people can no longer access home ownership, they go into market rental. And when people can no longer access market rental, because there's a lot more people in market rental, they go into the affordable rental supply. But when the affordable rental supply has downward pressure, there's more pressure on social housing. And when there's more pressure on social housing, we increase the pressure on transitional housing, which I'll talk about in a minute. And when people cannot access transitional housing, which is really the golden goose, transitional housing is where we really keep people out of homelessness, people end up on the streets. So we have to think about what's happening along that entire continuum of housing if we want to begin to address homelessness. Now we have another problem, and it's called the equity myth. And this is all still within that first band, which is around market home ownership. And the equity myth is the myth that home ownership is a good way to build wealth for most people. Now, ironically, back in 1970, my mom and dad were not thinking about building wealth. They were thinking about, they had 3 little girls to raise. They were thinking about a family. And back in 1970, no one was saying, hey, buy a house. It's a great way to, in the year 2000, you can sell that house for a fortune. That wasn't the idea. This is a relatively new idea. The idea that you can build equity through home ownership is actually something that comes as a result of the financialization of housing. It's precisely because we now have these new players and we're treating housing like a commodity. We're treating housing as a way to hold wealth. It's precisely for that reason that we have this new idea that this is a really good way to build equity. And that was an idea that already existed in 2000. I remember vividly when my husband and I were trying to piece together money for that down payment for a mortgage, my mother-in-law saying to me, oh, you'll build a great nest egg with this. Thinking again that this was about financial planning. And we, of course, never did that math. But it's important to know that this idea that generating wealth through home ownership, this is a new idea, and it's not a timeless truth. And I would argue it's a problematic idea that is leading to homelessness that we see today. So this idea of an asset class, that housing is an asset class, or that housing is a equity vehicle, is precisely tied to and linked to the fact that we now see people being underhoused and homeless. You kind of can't have both. We can't be treating housing like it's a way to build equity and housing as a way to generate homes for everyone. Those two things actually run in conflict with each other. As painful as that might be, it's absolutely true. Now, of course, for some people, you can build equity through home ownership. The first thing is you win the birth year lottery. My mom and dad won the birth year lottery. They didn't mean to, but they did. When they bought that first house, they didn't say, hey, this is a good financial plan, but boy, did it turn out to be. And actually, I'm in that category too. That's not the case for my children. There's no way at 12 times the average income that a house can actually be an equity vehicle for an individual. Might be for a large corporation that's not tying the asset to a yearly income. But for a family in a community, the math doesn't work. It's impossible for that to be true. It's also true only if you buy in the right city and in the right neighborhood at the right time. It's not unilaterally true. It's not true everywhere. It's also not true if you divorce, because then you're forced to sell and create 2 new households. It's also, and this is a really big one, it's not true if interest rates are not favorable indefinitely. What happens when interest rates go up? What happens when they go up a lot? There was a time in the 80s when those same people who bought homes in the 70s were pretty sure that they had a boondoggle on their hands because interest rates were 18, 19, 20, 23% in some places. So their home was actually, let's pay this thing off as fast as we can because it's costing us so much in interest. So we're in this strange moment in history where money is cheap and free, almost, but we don't control that. No one in this room controls that. You could argue no one in this country even controls that. Maybe Germany controls global interest rates. But if interest rates don't stay favorable indefinitely, the equity question becomes highly suspect. Another question is whether your housing needs change suddenly. I have a sister whose husband got transferred outside of the GTA. They owned a home here for 3 years. They sold the home. They moved to another community. They bought a new home there. They lived there for 5 years. Then he got transferred again. So they sold that house. They moved back to the GTA. Houses had gone up here. She did the math. She was out about $50,000. She would have been better off if she'd been renting for that 8-year period. But she had this idea in her head that a home equals equity, not that owning a home could potentially be something that was very costly. And as long as homes are treated as investment vehicles, as long as we have other segments of the market that are buying into home ownership and disconnecting homes from local wages, we have a very serious problem around this idea of homes generating equity. And then lastly, this is one that I don't know much about, but it's become a given. I spoke a couple of days ago at the Canadian Real Estate Association, and I was surprised to see they have policy papers. They're doing a tremendous amount of work around money laundering in the real estate industry. So think about that local entry-level nurse or teacher or planner trying to buy a home, and there's this, in an environment where there's money laundering taking place. How do you even begin to access stable home ownership? So this idea that equity is inherent in our approach to housing is deeply problematic, and it's a myth that we need to bust, because if we don't bust it, we won't begin building the kind of housing that we need. We need to address a whole series of market failures, and one of the things we need to do is limit debt. One of the reasons that we encourage debt is because we believe debt leads to equity. But I've just spent a lot of time trying to demonstrate how that isn't necessarily true, unless your life is really golden, and you have to be my age or a little bit older as a starting point for that to be true. We also need to mitigate price escalations, and there's a whole variety of ways that we can do that through policies. And one is a vacant homes tax. Vancouver put in a vacant homes tax and immediately saw the market flooded with cheap rentals. People who were putting their unit that no one was living in on the market to avoid the vacant home tax. That's a pretty powerful outcome that demonstrates the magnitude of the problem. We also need more land in the public trust. In Amsterdam, a tremendous amount of the land is owned by the municipality and rented to people who live in the city. And the way that prices are controlled and mitigated is through the rent of the land. That's how prices are mitigated and how prices are kept down. Land in the public trust is a really powerful way of ensuring we're providing housing to everyone. And then also limiting investor class activity. And I say investor class because we talk a lot about foreign owners and foreign money, but there's reason to believe that a significant amount of the speculation and the empty homes and the empty condos that we see in the Canadian market actually comes from a Canadian investor class, from a class of Canadians who've already made a tremendous amount of money in the real estate market, who are now investing back into the Canadian market. And if that's providing access to rental stock, that can be okay. The problem is there's no way to ensure that that rental stock stays at a stable price. You're going to think my family is full of horror stories, but that's not true. I'm going to tell you another story, though, about my nephew, who is 28 years old. He's married, he has 2 kids. He's starting up a fantastic company, and he's put all of his money into his company, and he rents in this city. So in 5 years, he's moved 6 times. He wants to be in a condo. He's got cash. He wants to be in a building where he can have great amenities. There's only one problem. He keeps getting bumped out so that the rent can be increased. Because in a market-driven housing system, it's very difficult to have stable, long-term housing. So that gets to the next piece, which is really the big opportunity, which is diversifying the delivery of both housing types, the kind of housing that we're providing, but also tenures. We need more rental. Now, the number one reason why we argue against rental, we say, oh, rental is throwing your money away. Well, you know, why would you be paying someone else your rent? Well, that's based on the assumption that home ownership generates equity. But what if home ownership doesn't generate equity? Think back to my sister who moved twice and lost $50,000. She would have been much better off if she'd in fact rented. But her assumption in her head was that she was going to generate equity. So we need to shift the dial. We need to think about rental housing in a different way. This is just a slide that points to the risk around debt. And I wanted to show you this because I've been talking about this a bit, and I'm always surprised at how surprised people are to see this. So if we look at the G7 countries, Canada is now the country that has the highest household debt to gross domestic product, 4 times that of the United States. Now, this is the real kicker. Last week, there was a story in Bloomberg News about the fact that young Canadians now are taking on very high level of debt, and it's not associated with home ownership. It's student loans and what's called lifestyle debt. So here we have a situation where access to housing is highly compromised because of debt very early on in life that isn't related in any way to housing. It used to be, and it was for me, that my big first moment of debt was taking on a mortgage. So now we're in a situation, it's a whole brave new world. So now imagine high levels of debt without any kind of asset, and access to housing is 12 times the yearly wage. We have to think about a fundamentally different model. And this is where I'd like to talk a bit about affordable rental housing in particular. Because we can significantly increase access to stable housing by focusing on rental supply. We need a bigger vision for shifting our supply to rental. If you look at the election right now, it's very interesting to watch the leaders, other than the NDP. Both Scheer and Trudeau have focused on extending debt and providing access to debt to provide access to home ownership. Well, if you don't address supply, just providing more people access to more debt actually just raises the price. It's a really precarious proposal on both parts. They're a little bit different, but both of them have the same underlying assumption. What we really need is significantly more housing. The vacant homes tax is part of a way of doing that, ensuring that all the housing that exists in the city is being used as housing and not being used primarily as an investment vehicle, but also significantly increasing rental supply is how we unlock this. But I also want to talk for a second about transportation costs, because we often talk about access to housing and housing affordability, but we don't talk about the overall household budget. On average in Canada, 20% of a household budget is spent on transportation costs. Now, I would argue that's a failure of urban planning. It's a failure of my profession. The cities have been designed in such a way that people have to spend a lot of money owning cars, maintaining that car, paying for insurance, paying for gas. in order to get to work every day and in order to get around. So a critical part of addressing housing affordability is actually the redesign of our cities to provide the choice and the option where it's possible to live and work without having to use a car, where it's possible to live and work getting around on transit, cycling, and walking. So when we think about increasing rental supply, there's a risk if we do what we did in the 60s, where we built a lot of rental housing way out in the suburbs, where you had to own 3 cars. The opportunity is to take land that we own close to transit and to build affordable rental close to transit. And for anyone who wants to know a little bit more about this, there's an index. It's the Housing and Transportation Index. And it's about understanding household affordability by looking together at all of these costs that are the 2 largest costs. Most households spend more money on transportation than they do on food. On food, on average, is 16% of a household budget, whereas transportation is 20%. Part of shifting how we build housing and deliver housing supply is about thinking differently about tenure, which is why I started out about talking about ownership and really debunking the myths around ownership. Because things that were true in 1970 are not true today, and they're not going to be true today. There's no scenario where we can imagine that what happened in 1970 will reoccur. This is a project in Parkway Forest, which is along Shepherd Avenue. This is Victoria Park subway station, and as a result of building the subway station out to Victoria Park, we put in place a master plan to create a community where we're significantly increasing the supply of affordable rental housing. This came about as a result of a master planning process that was about thinking very intentionally about how we deliver a different kind of community and a different kind of housing product. What you see in the foreground is a new community center. And this is right on a transit stop. So there's an opportunity to live in this community with another 20% lower in your overall household costs because you can take transit to get where you're going. We need new partners who will deliver new forms of housing in complete communities where people can do a whole variety of things in that community within close walking distance to home. Some of you may recognize this. This might seem like a surprising image to show in a conversation about homelessness. This is the Mirvish Village redevelopment at Bathurst and Bloor Street. And this is a really important part of the shift I'm talking about, and this is why. This is 100% rental. It's right on the subway. It's a significant amount of density in an area where it's possible for people to live without a car. When I talk about new partnerships, I am talking about things like working with industry to deliver affordability. Now, at the time, when we approved this project, we required 20% affordable housing. 10% are deep affordable. And there's a partnership with 3 different non-for-profit organizations who are providing that affordable housing in the deep affordable category. The opportunity for us is to think in a much bolder and more aggressive way around how we can deliver affordable housing in relation to market housing that's being built in our city, and ensuring that we're getting the transportation piece right, because this is such a big part of the over-affordability question. So to diversify the affordable housing stock, there's really 3 big moves that we can embrace in order to do this. The first is using public land that's in the public trust in order to deliver affordable rental housing. Prioritizing 100% affordable rental housing on city-owned land is an enormous opportunity. Right now, we're doing about 20% on city-owned land. It should be 100%. The demand is so great. And remember, in terms of the continuum, if we built 100% affordable rental housing, there's an infinite amount of demand. All of that housing would be filled. The second is requiring higher thresholds of affordable product in private development. So one of the ways we do this is through inclusionary zoning. So in our zoning laws, requiring that developers, as a part of their approval, have to build affordable housing. And the second is what I call the 3 by 3 by 3 rule. This comes from Germany. It's executed all across the Netherlands as well. In every single development, the developer is required to build a third social housing. So there's new social housing stock that's being built by private developers, operated by the private developer, sometimes by the city, with a subsidy that comes from the city in order to develop it, a third. The second third is for affordable. So social, affordable. So affordable is below market, not at market. And then the last third is market housing. The developer can charge whatever the market will bear. Every single project in the Netherlands, this 3 by 3 by 3 is the rule. So what's happening is every time a new unit gets built of market housing, a unit of affordable gets built, and a unit of social housing gets built. We're nowhere near doing that in this context. There's no reason why we couldn't implement the exact same model in the Canadian context. And look, we're in the middle of this incredible building boom in our country. And yet, we're building market product, which I've explained is really linked to an investor class. It's really not linked to providing housing for the people who live and work in this city. And then the third big move to diversify the affordable housing stock is to use land differently. Right now, we have a buy-sell model. What happens if more land goes into trusts? We keep more land in public ownership. What an incredible asset. Let's not sell off our land. Let's keep our land and use it for a public good instead of someone else making a buck on it or the municipality making a quick buck on it by selling it. We need to be building more accessory dwelling units. So what that is, this is an old idea. Secondary suites like basement apartments, granny flats and garages, second small homes, laneway homes on properties. We could be infilling our existing neighborhoods that are pretty low density with smaller micro units. Now, 28.3% of the Canadian population lives alone. Isn't that incredible? That's more than a quarter lives alone. So this idea of building accessory units onto an existing home is actually quite brilliant. You're part of a community, you're close to your neighbors, and these are smaller units that are for individuals. We also need to upend traditional zoning in order to enable more units to be built in neighborhoods. And this one I've mentioned already, which is the idea of community land trusts, providing opportunities for communities to be a part of developing housing or co-housing where there's shared amenities, shared facilities, smaller units, and as a result, housing that is more affordable. So I've talked about market ownership. I've talked about what I believe an enormous part of the solution is, which is affordable rental housing. I'm going to talk now just for a moment about transitional housing, because transitional housing is the really big opportunity. Now you might be thinking, well, this was a lecture on homelessness. Why are we not talking about homelessness? And I would like to suggest to you that I'm talking about the things that we need to do to address homelessness. Once we've got to homelessness, we've missed the boat. We need to be addressing the problems along our entire housing continuum in order to ensure that everyone has access to housing. A big part of that is transitional housing. This is housing for people who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness, who need supports in order to transition into more permanent housing. Now let's face it, you can have all the supports in the world, you can have great transitional housing, but if you don't have that affordable rental product, so what? People need to be able to transition into that affordable rental housing. And this is why the whole spectrum matters. This is why we just can't fix one part of the challenge we face today. We can't just fix this by building tons of transitional housing. The whole notion behind transitional is that it's a place where you stay for a while and then you move on to something more permanent. Now, there are some excellent models in the world where transitional housing has worked really well. And I think there's an opportunity to be delivering this at scale, but it must go hand in hand with delivering affordable rental, because otherwise we're setting people up to fail. If you go into transitional housing and there's no affordable rental housing that you can get into on the other end, we're just creating another form of a crisis. So the opportunity here is to think about these two things as really the bulk of the solution to the challenge that we're trying to solve here. So this is an example from Finland. This is a building that houses 21 people. Importantly, there's 7 staff who work in this building. Now, I went to Finland as an example because Helsinki has the phenomenal, they're calling it a miracle, but they have in fact upended homelessness in Helsinki. There's no more homelessness. People do not sleep in the rough anymore in Helsinki. They've gotten rid of almost all their emergency shelters. They only have one shelter left. And it's for a very simple reason. They decided to stop focusing on the emergency and to start focusing on real housing. And they actually called this plan a door with your name on it, which I think is really beautiful. And this is what the product that they built looked like. And the goal in bringing people into this transitional housing was to get them to a point in their life where they could get into affordable rental housing. That was the goal. However, the mandate was such that they made it very clear that no one would ever be removed from transitional housing. So it's a little bit of a misnomer. The idea being that if you wanted to stay, you can stay as long as you want. Some people move out of this transitional housing after a year or 18 months, and some people have been in this transitional housing for 7 years and do not want to leave. Importantly, the cost of focusing on emergency shelters and emergency room services has actually been shifted proactively to providing the staff who provide the support within a community for people with addictions, with mental health, people struggling with joblessness or other issues. That support is provided right in the community. We have an example closer to home. Some of you may recognize this. I was on a bike tour. That's why there's all these cyclists out in front in the photograph. This is in Vancouver. Very similar model to Helsinki, except this is modular housing that was built in 3 months. From the day of procurement to the day of occupancy was 3 months. This is an initiative that was led by BC Housing in combination with CMHC. This is a very powerful and important model. There's only one problem with it. We need it at scale. We can't be doing 40 units or 50 units. We actually need to be doing hundreds of units. That's the first part of the solution. And the second part is this model depends on us building affordable rental. Because the risk, of course, is that we get people into transitional housing and they're ready to access what will be their permanent home in an affordable rental product, and that product doesn't exist. And we have a lot of catching up to do because we haven't built enough housing over the course of the past 20 years. So we need a shift in emphasis. This is what they did in Helsinki. They shifted from an emergency to providing housing. They also were very generous with the supports that they provided in this housing. 7 people live in this community to provide the supports that are needed to help people with the great challenges that they face. And the last key part of this is a focus on real housing for everyone. The risk and the challenge that we see in the Toronto context, several months ago, there was, at City Council, there was a report indicating that the city staff needed another $50 million for emergency housing for this winter. And staff wrote a report and said, oh, that's okay. We've got the money because we didn't spend our budget on building affordable housing. And I have to tell you, I felt like weeping when I saw that. Because we are continuing to feed and build a crisis if we don't shift our focus to be building at scale affordable rental housing, ensuring that everyone has access to the housing they need, and shifting to focus on supportive housing as opposed to shelters, because supportive housing is about transitioning people into a stable circumstance. So I would suggest in closing that emergency shelters and homelessness are an outcome. They're an outcome when we fail at delivering housing throughout the entire continuum. And I hope that the message came through loud and clear. I actually think the entire continuum is screwed up. We actually have to fix the entire continuum. We have to start with market housing, and we need really strong measures in place. The opportunity for us is right in the center. The opportunity is to focus on affordable rental housing and transitional housing to ensure that we are preventing people from ending up in a situation where they are homeless, and we're providing the care that's required and the care that we can easily provide as a society, because let's face it, we're a wealthy society, we're an educated society, we know how to deliver. We really do. It's being done on the West Coast, it's being done in other places. We just now need to ramp it up and do it at scale. I'm hopeful because I believe there's a momentum that's building, there's a willingness that's building around doing something that is truly transformative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think we'll take just a few questions just for Jennifer before we bring the panel down. So there are some microphones around. We'll maybe take 2 or 3 just for Jennifer on her alone, if anyone has any questions. If we can yell from there, but I don't know if we're going to hear you. I'm going to tell my wife a miracle occurred this evening because my thinking shifted. So that's I must say that's a compliment. Start at the mic up there.
Well, Jennifer, you talked a lot about the housing continuum. Can you talk a little bit about investing in prevention and what role prevention might play in this?
Sure. In some ways, when I'm talking about the housing continuum, I am talking about that as a form of prevention. When we don't have enough affordable rental stock, people end up getting bumped into and requesting social housing. When we don't have enough social housing, people end up getting bumped into emergency shelters. So the prevention piece is about planning for and designing housing at all of the various levels along those continuum. We are, on the one hand, I said, hey, we shouldn't be encouraging people to take on more debt, particularly not when owning a home is 12 times your annual income. But the reality is, when we limit the amount of debt people can take on, we actually push people who would have been going into home ownership into more rental housing, and we provide more pressure on rental housing. So the only way to prevent this is to shift our approach to supply. There's significantly more supply that we need to be providing along all levels of the spectrum. And I would argue with market housing, the supply needs to come through doing a better job at regulating and ensuring that when we build a home, it becomes a home for someone to live in.
Great. One more, if you want to try, if we can hear you from there.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I wanted to ask, how do you think we can accomplish this vision in an environment where there seems to be entrenched opposition to any increase in taxes to fund these kinds of housing initiatives?
That's Dr. Stephen Wang, one of our experts in housing and homelessness.
Wonderful,
and health.
thank you. I have some very good news on that front, which is there's quite a bit of data that shows it's actually less expensive to keep people in transitional housing and to keep people out of our emergency rooms than to have them in transitional housing. So, and I would reference the Helsinki example to you because they're at a point now where they can actually do the math and they can look at the implication on healthcare costs and the implication on emergency shelter costs. They've been shutting down their emergency shelters. And emergency shelters are extremely costly to operate. They're not a good model for providing housing. So part of this is actually about saying, we're going to spend our money differently. We're going to shift it around. Right now, we've been spending our money on emergency shelters. We've been focused on that, but we haven't been building up our access to affordable housing and transition. So, one of the things I learned at the city when I was there as chief planner is there's actually lots of money. It's just about priorities where that money gets spent. So I don't think being in a tax conservative environment is problematic at all. It's just about shifting the priorities and delivering a plan in keeping with those priorities.
Wonderful, thank you, Stephen. Last question before our panel, Don?
Well, I guess this is more of a comment. I don't know if you're aware, but transitional housing in the mental health field is an old idea that was started for about the past 20 years.
Yeah.
You know, we used to believe in this. We used to believe that there should be like levels of housing for people in relation to their level of disability with certain levels of support. It turned out that it didn't work very well because of the instability built into the model. It meant that as you got better, your reward was you lost your housing. You had to move to another level and relate to other people.
Yeah.
So this has been replaced now by what's generally known as the homes first approach. And the homes first approach sort of disengages your level of disability from your housing need and says that everyone should be entitled to stable, permanent housing. And that once that's made available for people, you then begin to work more intensively on some of the other issues. This has been shown to be much more effective than this older transitional model. And in fact, it's been studied in 5 cities across Canada relatively recently and shown to be highly successful. So I think you need to rethink this idea of transition and transitional housing, because it's an idea that we've tried and it really hasn't worked very well.
Well, yeah, and maybe the language isn't quite right, but in fact, the Helsinki
Studied in 5 cities across.
is a housing first policy. It's actually called housing first. The notion of transitional is about recognizing that there's a portion of the population that does actually need transitional supports. And that's why the emphasis on ensuring that people can stay in their housing is absolutely critical. I think the risk is that and I think this is actually what happened, the notion of transitional housing went out of vogue and it just disappeared. Supports disappeared altogether. And we know that people coming from the street, I did a lot of work in the beginning of my career with at-risk youth and bringing at-risk youth who were on the street into employment. And what we did in our organization was we provided them with the transitional supports that they needed. These were youth who could not go from living on the streets to holding down a job. There were a whole series of things that they needed to be supported on before they were able to transition into a full-time job. So I actually think it was a mistake to throw the baby out with the bathwater and to say, oh, well, everyone should have a permanent home. The reality is there is a segment of the population dealing with everything from mental health to addiction issues to joblessness that do need supports. And if those supports are provided in a community, that can be a very successful way of stabilizing that individual, which I think is the overall goal, is that they're stable, regardless of whether they stay in that housing or they move on to something else.
In the Homes First model, the support is provided, but it's provided from outside of the housing situation, so the support can be titrated based on the level of need. In the transitional model, if the level of need changes, you have to move to a different residential setting, which is a much more disruptive way of dealing. That's why the Homes First model has become more popular.
Yeah, so I've referred to transitional as more broadly as including what you're referring to as the Homes First.
Great, thank you. So just because we have our panel here, I know there's lots more questions. I promised 2 or 3, and that was 3. I'm going to invite our panelists to come down, please, to join us. So Jennifer's provided a very inspiring and visionary continuum, this idea of commodification and the way we're part of an entire social context and how it links to housing. It's very similar to what we see in healthcare sometimes in the emergency room when we're clogged up. Dr. Rutledge, Emerge Doc, is looking at me. The way it's really a canary in the coal mine of a giant system that's flawed. It was really very analogous. I was wondering if you were thinking of that. So this is our panel. I'm going to introduce everyone very briefly before we get to some questions. With us, we have Dr. Matt Levy. Matt, just raise your hand. Everyone will know who you are there. He's a staff psychiatrist here at St. Michael's Hospital. He's medical director of our community mental health service, assistant professor of psychiatry with extensive clinical experience with our clients we serve, many experiencing homelessness. He's also a sports fan, I know that. He had a picture with the Raptors trophy he showed me, so it's pretty cool. Deane O'Leary, whom I shared an office with in our program, knows me well because she's heard me swear at the computer screen several times. She's the team leader of our mental health and addiction outreach service at St. Michael's. She also told me she likes to read magazines backwards, so that's very interesting. Barb Panter, thank you for joining us, Barb. Barb has been working with homeless and marginalized populations for almost 25 years. She's manager of housing and drop-in services at St. Stephen's Community House. She teaches harm reduction to nurses, social workers, and paramedics. She's known for her compassion and her passion for social justice. And she told me that she's just got new glasses. They're progressives, so her nodding constantly might not have been agreement. It might have just been her trying to see the screen. And finally, Dr. Ilana Heather Shawn is an emergency room psychiatrist, part of our program here at St. Michael's Hospital, and lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry, and gets incredible things done that I'm just admire every time I see them. So just to start it off, I'm going to give one to everyone. So let's start with Matt. You're on the front lines. How does housing and homelessness and mental health connect, or how does mental health interfere or intersect with that?
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for an excellent talk, Jennifer. So first of all, I want to say that the vast majority of people who are homeless want housing. They want their own place, and I love the Helsinki model in terms of, you know, a door with your name on it, because that's what people really want. They want housing. Part of the tragedy with people who have mental illness and are homeless is that many of them, because of their mental illness, are unable to work. They're on disability, and yet the amount of money that they're able to get from their disability payments is not enough to be able to afford housing. So they're condemned, you know, on the one hand, dealing with suffering from their mental illness, and secondly, with homelessness. And then the homelessness itself tends to exacerbate people's mental health problems and to, you know, can precipitate mental health issues as well as perpetuate it. So it's extremely important to get people housing as quickly as possible. And our teams here at St. Mike's, we try to do our best to do that. It's very challenging because of the supply issue, that there isn't enough supply of subsidized housing, social housing, transitional housing. There's just not enough supply of the housing, and our clients suffer.
Great. Ilana, you see people in the emergency room coming in with the challenge. Just any comments how it challenge for you and what you see in serving our clients? Grab the microphone too so people can hear, please.
So, yeah, I think people present to emergency departments for all variety of reasons, but certainly homelessness can be a reason someone is presenting to hospitals, save for any mental health symptoms. Just the fact that they are newly homeless or currently homeless, whether it's you're living in a shelter and all your belongings have been stolen, or your medications have been stolen, or your ID is stolen. So you're dealing with a population of people, they don't have an address where someone can send them a new ID, or they don't have a phone where their new caseworker can call them. All these sorts of things very much impacting someone's health, and then you have no other options, and that's why you come to the hospital. And then the hospital's really faced with challenges of, this may not be something the hospital can fix, and yet we are trying to help them because we're their last resort. They've tried this, that, and the other, and they have not been able to solve the problem, and now they're coming to us because they're saying, I'm backed into a corner, and I feel like maybe living is not possible for me right now, given all the things that I'm faced with. So it's a real challenge, and I think all these different community organizations, the hospital, everyone is really trying to work very hard to help these people, and people are trying to work very hard to help themselves.
Thank you. Barb, maybe you can just grab the mic so we can hear you better. Please speak close. You see people trying to connect from the emergency room to your services. Can you just give us your perspective? Or?
Yeah, I think my mind is just like brimming with ideas right now. There's so much I would like to say. I think people often use the emergency room as their primary health care when they're homeless. That's where they go. They wait until things are really, really bad and they're very sick, and then they go to Emerge. And then it's left to folks in Emerge to deal with this whole spectrum of problems that a hospital isn't necessarily set up to deal with. And the person in Emerge doesn't necessarily know all of the things that a hospital could offer. They just know that they're sick and they need some help. And then the agencies like St. Stephen's Community House, where I work, that could provide lots of other supports, we're not open 24 hours. We don't have staff available all the time. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when someone has decided that, no, I'm actually really sick, the only place really to go is the ER. But we could be providing lots of supports for this person, and they just don't get connected. And I think the challenge for us is just better communication between hospitals and particularly emergency departments, but whole hospital systems and our community-based services, because so often we're not connecting, we're not communicating well enough, and so the individual who's homeless is just kind of bounced back and forth without real connection.
Great. Any other of those zillion ideas running through your head you want to share?
Yeah, well,
Go ahead. If you have something else,
I don't wanna hog
please,
the
because I'm
microphone
going to forget. So,
I'll share the space.
okay. Deanne, I hear you on the phone doing remarkable things and facing, interestingly, some social justice and stigma challenges. You want to comment? Yeah, just grab that microphone right up close so we can all hear.
Yeah, I guess I'll speak to the stigma piece. There's a lot of community workers in this room right
A little
now.
louder.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think I'll speak to the stigma piece first. There's a lot of community workers in this room right now. I recognize a lot of you. And the stigma piece is so layered. So I'd say social workers, case managers, anybody who's providing housing support, has stories of and experiences of going with somebody to apply for market rent housing, going to meet with a landlord and, filling out a housing application, handing it over and seeing the look of disappointment on a landlord's face when they see that the person's on ODSP. And, both you and the person you're trying to support know in that moment that person's not getting that unit. It's such a layered thing. I know and I don't want to make this about me, but several years ago, I was looking for my own apartment with my partner, and I had the most interesting experiences. So in one instance, I wrote down as a social worker, and the landlord kept asking me questions, and I thought she was just interested, and people are often interested in what you do when you're a social worker. And what I realized later is that she was mostly and I told her that I work with people who have mental health challenges, sometimes struggling with addiction, and what she was really worried about was that I was going to work from home, and that I was going to be bringing people onto her property who had addiction and mental health challenges. And then in that same housing search, my partner is Black, and I actually ended up going to the Human Rights Tribunal with a landlord because I felt very strongly that we'd been discriminated against because of the color of his skin, and I felt we had enough evidence about it. And so we went to Human Rights Tribunal, and one interesting thing that I found out there was that there's actually not a lot of precedents. People don't do that. And so there's really no oversight for the discrimination that's happening when people are looking for housing. So it's definitely challenging. I think even at a different level, I know when the city's been looking with the gentrification happening downtown, which is another social justice issue. They're looking for spots for new shelters, and there's a few things involved, which one is, what can they afford in terms of renting, and it's very, very expensive. And the other piece is that, landlords are also saying no to the city to rent space to them to even have shelters. And so this discrimination and stigma that people are experiencing is it's very, very layered and very, I would say, entrenched.
Jennifer, you want to comment on that? I'm curious. I'll just pass the microphone down to Jennifer. You got your
I
mic.
have this one here still. Well, I'll just provide a comment really to pick up on what both Matt and Deanne said, which is these things, I think, become a really big issue when you don't have enough supply. Discrimination becomes an issue when you don't have enough supply because people will discriminate. You're not going to sit there with an empty building. So it's a reflection of the fact that we are so short on supply that you end up in a situation where people who are the most in need are going to have the hardest time accessing housing, which really brings back this issue of ensuring that there's a sufficient amount of supply at every single point in the system.
I'd add to that, that even with the housing first model, I mean, that's really been a challenge, is actually finding, even though people, technically have the subsidies and, hypothetically can afford, the market rent units. One of the biggest challenges with that model has been that it's just purely finding places for people to live, and where landlords will accept ODSP and the subsidy, knowing that the person is likely, having some challenges. So, that's a big factor.
Anyone else want to comment on this one?
Well, I think also one of the things is for a lot of people who are homeless and struggling with mental health issues is issues around anxiety, trusting people. Many people have trauma histories, demoralization. So when people run into barriers, when they're trying to access housing and it's not working out, they get even more depressed, more demoralized, and more hopeless. And we also see high rates of suicide in this population as well. So there's so many factors that play into the worsening of people's mental health when they're homeless, and how much more recovery they can have if they have housing.
Barb?
I just wanted to sort of play on that idea of stigma, because certainly the folks that we work with experience a lot of stigma, but I also think that agencies and programs that work with people who are homeless, particularly dealing with mental health and substance using issues, also experience stigma. So we're looking at the results of 10 years of austerity. Our funding for our drop-in has been pretty much flatlined for the last 10 years. We can only open for 4 hours a day. That's our drop-in program, because we simply don't have the money to keep it open longer. And so when we say we want to serve people who are homeless, and yes, for sure, in your ER, send people to our drop-in, but only only before 11:30 in the morning, because after that we have to close. And I think this has a huge impact on how we're able to serve people. We would like to be doing lots more. We would like to be able to be open 24 hours a day and be able to serve people, take them to apartments and take them to doctor's appointments and get them connected with service providers, physicians in the community. We would love to be able to do that. We simply don't have the funding. We simply don't have the resources. And I just also wanted to say, Jennifer, I'm really glad that you're feeling hopeful about that things maybe are about to change, because those of us on the front lines don't feel so hopeful anymore. This has been a really long grind, and we're really, really tired.
Well, that kind of links into what I was going to say, the comment I wanted to make. I think it's problematic to talk about it in terms of austerity. There is so much money being spent in this city right now. It's where it's being spent. Yes. We do not have an austerity problem. We have a priority problem. Yes. So we are spending $1 billion to rebuild a very tiny portion of the Gardner Expressway so that 3% of the morning commuters can get downtown 2 minutes faster. That's $1 billion. That is so much money. It's the largest item in our capital budget for the next 10 years. And I say that, it may seem unrelated, but it's not. There's a tremendous amount of money being spent in this city. And it's being spent, I would argue, in places where it's a mix-up of priorities. The priorities are all messed up. So I think, this is just another transportation one, but frequently the city puts extra money into transportation projects in order to build roads faster because it makes commuters angry. So they'll find an extra $1 million. They'll find an extra $1 million in the budget, and boom, there's an extra $1 million to speed up a transportation project. But when was the last time they found you $1 million, right? It's not austerity, it's priorities. It's priorities, and I think that's a really important part of this conversation. It's about making this a priority in our city, which is also, I think, why I think talking about the whole housing spectrum, it's about where's the priority going to be. And it takes a lot of us screaming really loudly to get extra shelter beds open in the winter. And that too is a reflection of the mix-up in priorities. That there has to be advocates expending energy on that, to me, is an absolute absurdity. It's a reflection of how the priorities are all screwed up. We're sort of fighting for the wrong things that the city should be doing as part of its moral obligation to be providing access to the services and the housing that everyone in this city needs. So I think we actually let politicians and civic leaders off the hook when we use that word, because I think we need to be pushing on them and saying, why isn't this a priority? And look at the conversation right now happening in our federal election campaign. Has anyone talked about homelessness? Or housing has barely been talked about in this entire campaign. Barely. It's not even really been a big issue, although it's a really big priority, I think, across the entire country. But it's barely been talked about.
And the other thing that's conspicuously missing in the election talks, from my perspective, is the overdose crisis. So, you know, how many Canadians need to die before this does become an election issue?
So I'm going to take one more comment, then we'll open up for a few questions for the panel. But Dr. Shawn, I see coming in on her bicycle, smiling and happy in the morning. And when I know the state of need of some of our clients that our institution remarkably does an unbelievable job with. People work here because they want to treat this population. It's not the only place. We have many places, but it's particularly people who feel that with their hearts. And Barb, I hear how burnt out. I know we all get like that, and we get a bit of, compassion fatigue. But Ilana, you come in smiling on your bike. What's the secret? How do you do this? Because I know who you see and what the challenges that emerge are, including the housing and the concurrent addiction and mental health conditions. What's the secret?
Well, I think there are good things that are happening also. I think there are caring people. I think that, we see people who feel very alone, who feel very underserved. But we also see, I'm thinking about this landlord situation, not all landlords are bad. I see landlords bringing their tenants in because they're worried about them, because they are the only people that some people have in their lives who actually check in on them, who say, how you doing? I'm worried about you. I think we should go get you some help. So I think there are both sides to it. And certainly, there's a lot to feel sad about. There's a lot to feel disappointed about. There's a lot to feel hopeless about. And I do think also there are innovative people coming up with programs that are trying to sort of figure out what the holes are and fill them in as best we can. And we see people who truly, when they leave, feel like, I came in here and I didn't feel like anything was going to change. I'm thinking about a guy who came from elsewhere in the country. He had no one here. His ID was stolen. I think he really felt by the time he got to the hospital, like, forget it, there are no options. And by the time he left, we had found him a bed where he could stay for 30 days. He was going to meet with a new person who was going to get him ID. He was going to get on OW with a plan to get on ODSP. He had meetings set up to get a new doctor. So these things can happen, and it is good because you can't go to work every day and think like nothing's going to happen and everything's going to be bad. So it is nice when those sorts of things happen, and certainly, I think it does, if we can engage more people in the population to feel like they have a role in helping each other, it makes it a lot easier.
That's great. Matt?
I want to share a good news story too from one of our St. Michael's Hospital mental health teams about one of our patients who had been suffering from severe psychosis, very disorganized in his thinking, and had actually been living in stairwells of buildings to stay warm during the winter. And one of the drop-ins he was visiting referred him to our team, and our team engaged with him, built a relationship, provided treatment to him. His disorganization and thinking cleared up. He was able to think much more clearly. We were able to find him housing. He started volunteering at a church, and he also eventually got a job part-time cleaning. So he still suffers from some symptoms, but overall his life is much better, and he has housing now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Question or two from the audience before we, just to honor the time. Start at the top, because I know you're waiting, and then we'll come to this person here. Yes, if you can, unless you can yell really loud.
Hello. Thank you very much, Jennifer. It was a wonderful talk. Really enjoyed it. When we talk about low rental housing, I think it's very important. There was a gentleman here who asked, where is the money going to come from? Are we going to, raise taxes? And I thought to myself, I read an article in the paper the other day, and the article was about the federal government spending approximately $100 million to procure 88 fighter jets at a cost of $100 million each. And I remember in 2017, the Canadian government, in fact, all four major parties supported a bill increasing the military budget by 70%. And over the next 20 years, the Canadian government is poised to spend an additional $553 billion on the military. And I thought to myself, the military is very important, our veterans are very important, but is there a way that we can maybe reduce that 70% to about 30% and reallocate some of those military dollars, towards human needs, such as, low rental, affordable housing?
Thank you.
And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, one of the reasons I talked about the a third model is because the great irony of our time is that there's a tremendous amount of wealth being generated through the real estate industry. If you look at the top 100 wealthiest Canadians right now, they're linked to the real estate industry in some way. So the model that's been used in Western Europe, where they're actually taking some of that wealth that's being generated from that industry and putting that back into ensuring there's housing for everyone, is actually a pretty good model. So there's a portion of subsidy in the social housing, in that a third. The social housing has a government subsidy. The affordable rental does not. The affordable rental is a contribution made by the developer in exchange for the market. So this isn't a model that's going to work unilaterally across the entire country, but it is a model that would work in Toronto, in a lot of locations in Toronto. So this idea, we need to actually be taking more from industry would be my argument. You can't kill the golden goose. People need to still want to develop, but there's a lot of wiggle room right now. When the housing market went kind of crazy back in 2016 in April, so what happened to people who own rental buildings is that their costs are fixed, but all of a sudden they saw prices escalate by 10%, 20%, 30%. That's just pure profit. Their costs are already fixed. So what we've seen in the rental market in this country is that you have fixed costs, you have escalating rents. There is a way to capture some of that value. And one of the ways is to have private sector partners doing this through a partnership with government, where government provides land. If you bring the land contribution into a development project, a developer can be made whole if the land, which is approximately 20% the cost of building a project, if that land is contributed by the municipality, you can actually have the private sector in that model delivering 100% affordable rental. So there's lots of models, there's lots of wealth in this industry, and the great asset that we have, I think, as a public sector is less our tax-paying dollars and more so the land asset that we have. So let's use that land asset to deliver affordable housing. But to your question about shifting around military spending, I'm not an expert in that, but what I will say, I believed that the City of Toronto had no money. Then I became the chief planner, and I spent an enormous amount of my time in budget meetings and realized, oh, this city finds $1 million, $10 million all the time. There's a lot of money. It's an issue of priorities. Where is it being spent? And I think, imagine if the land transfer tax was dedicated entirely to social services and homelessness. Right now, it actually pays a lot for roads. It's subsidized roads. I'm a strong believer we should put a price on roads. That shouldn't come out of general revenue. If you put a price on roads, you would immediately see, $500 million a year in the city's budget that would be freed up, that could be spent on the things that we really need to be spending money on.
So for our last question, the person with the flower, you had your hand up, and I think okay, the question was, what can she do? What should she put pressure on?
Well, everyone's looking at me. Well, I'm a big believer, people tend to get really cynical about politics and politicians. The other thing that I learned when I was a chief planner is that our politicians really, really matter. So getting engaged in the political process, I think tonight is a really important conversation, but this conversation about what are our priorities as a city. Winter is coming. We know what's going to happen is we're going to have a crisis of people on our streets. We know what's going to happen because we have done nothing differently in the past 12 months to suggest that we've taken care of people and prepared. We've done nothing differently. So I think engaging with your local councillor and engaging with the city, I think that the risk is that there isn't a groundswell of people who make it very clear and articulate to our political leaders that we do care and that this is a priority in our city and that we expect different outcomes in our city. And I think the onus is on us as citizens to do that and to convey that. And I'm using every opportunity I can to speak about that, and hopefully any opportunity that you have, you can do the same thing, because we actually know that's how change happens. There's a little 16-year-old girl who is changing the world right now by speaking up. And I think that's another reason to be really hopeful, that a groundswell of people can shift the political agenda.
Wonderful. I'm going to give everybody else one chance, because we got asked if there's one thing they can do. So from your perspectives of practitioners, health and homeless practitioners, is there anything you can advise our audience that you'd like to see done that people could do? If you had a wish list, Fantasyland.
I mean, I don't know if this is like necessarily something, it's a piece of what people can do, and because I'm a social worker, I feel like if I don't say it, I'm doing a disservice to the people that I work with. But in whatever discussions you're having, I think people need to, we're often talking about, when we talk about homelessness, we're often talking about like services, and we're talking about poverty, and we're talking about housing, and these are like very important conversations to continue to have whenever we can with politicians, whoever. But I think what we really need to do is we also need to add, a lens of anti-Black racism and, a lens of systemic discrimination against Indigenous people, even just by the sheer numbers and the overrepresentation in our shelter system. And so I would just encourage people to also include that in their conversations and to come at the issue of homelessness. If we really want to solve the issue of homelessness, using an anti-racism lens is something that we really, really need to do.
Thank you. Anybody else? 3 wishes being granted. No, never happens in life, does it?
I mean, I think definitely if everyone becomes more familiar with the Housing First model and read more about that, because that's really at the forefront, and what they're doing in Helsinki is fantastic. And I think if we're pushing that agenda of ending homelessness by providing everyone housing and the subsidy or the money for the housing, I think that would be key.
I think I would only just echo what's been said. Vote, make your voice heard, be loud, talk to people about this. If we want this to change, then we have to let people know that it needs to change. So yeah, be loud.
And I think probably by virtue of the fact that you're here right now, this is something you care about, and to sort of deliver that message to other people who maybe kind of care about it or don't know about it or don't really understand it, because there's lots and lots of people who maybe aren't closed to these ideas. They just don't know anything about it, and it's not so scary. It's just that there's a lot of people who maybe need our help or need a stronger voice or an advocate, and ideally we can try and multiply that.
Wonderful. So just to wrap up, I'm going to invite Lou Odette on behalf of the Odette family and sponsors of this wonderful event to just say thank you to all our speakers for us.
Thanks, Tom. I'm Lou Odette. I head up the P&L Odette Foundation, and so I represent the foundation tonight. But I'm joined by my fellow foundation director and my only sister, Francine, who's down here. There you go, Fran. So I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight, taking some time out to listen to what we have to say. We hosted this lecture with St. Mike's once a year because we felt it was very important to have a public discussion about this issue and to introduce some new ideas into the conversation about this very significant social failure in this city and other cities around the world. So I want to thank our panelists for all the work that they do in the trenches. I want to thank Tom for leading a very interesting discussion tonight. And I want to thank Jennifer in particular for a tremendous, inspiring lecture tonight. I do have something for her, just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you, Jennifer. That's it.
Thank you, everyone. Have safe travels home.